Welcome everyone. Today we're going to chat about building some mobile apps for iOS, Android. Instead of using JavaScript, TypeScript mainly. We're going to look at the Ionic framework, which is all TypeScript these days. But it's really about taking your web skills and doing mobile apps is the whole premise. The big thing is, why do we even care about all this mobile stuff? I love this quote that I ran across. That mobile represents the single largest technology innovation of all time. 10x faster than the PC boom, 2x faster than the internet, and 3x faster than social networking. Those are huge numbers. Mobile's everywhere. I'm sure most of us feel that too. You go out to dinner and just look around the room and see how many people are sitting there with their phone. And how many couples are sitting there and all they're doing is both of them are on the phone, not even chatting. It's the funniest thing to watch. I've even done it. I've had times where friends come over and are like, are you two going to spend time together or just be on the phone? And we're literally sitting there sending text messages back and forth to each other in the environment while we're looking at other stuff. It's like, that's where mobile works. So I really wanted to join that as well. I wanted to build a mobile app. I did just that. I actually built a game called Touch My Monkey. The exact reason why developers should never get to name products. It's a Simon Says game. Everything you'd expect out of the 80s, Simon Says, that had monkey faces on the buttons. That was the whole premise of it. Building all of this was done with the traditional development strategy. And this was Xcode. Would have been Android Studio if we ever got that far with it. We had full access to all of the clients, all the device power. Unfortunately, this is what it feels like developing that to me. Swift and Objective-C, none of that makes sense to me. Coming from a web development background, I don't have to worry about memory management and pointers, and none of it made sense. We got it done, it worked, but it was kind of sketchy. Times we're like, does this really work, not work? At some point, we're just waiting for it to fall over. I don't think I'd ever drive through this either. It's just kind of a crazy road. I'm like, whoever designed that. So that was back in 2009, 2010, when I was going through a lot of that. Well, fast forward 2014. I took a road trip. Live in Phoenix, took a road trip out to LA for one of their code camps. And there was a speaker that was showing off the new website. Actually, a new mobile version of their website. And it looked fantastic. Their previous version, literally the font was like 4-point font. And it just shrunk down everything. You couldn't read it. And he goes, oh, here's the new thing. It was amazing looking. I said, how long did it take you to do that? He's like, maybe 24 hours, 30 hours, somewhere in there. I go, what the heck did you use? He said, oh, I used this hybrid stuff. I used all my web skills to do it. HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript. He was able to deploy it to both platforms, which covers like 99% of the market. There's still the 1% that has a Windows phone, but they're going away quickly. And it was all built on top of Apache Cordova, which does two things for us. It's middleware that takes all of our web code, bundles it up so it runs on the actual device, and it gives us access to the device APIs, like network status, battery status, Bluetooth, geolocation, all the common stuff you would associate that an app would have. And it essentially runs everything in the web view for us, which is the browser engine. So Chromium, the iOS WebKits. Then you get the Apache Cordova to do all its work, and that ties into all the device APIs. So we don't have to worry about how do we actually do it. You just use a plugin. I love this quote that Zuckerberg said back in 2012. Biggest mistake they ever made at Facebook was betting on HTML5 over native. To me, it made sense at the time that they probably had some issues. People have since proven that they created a bad app. But if we look at what was going on at the time, 2012, which is not anymore, most people had two devices that were prevalent. iPhone 1 was still prevalent, which was only 620 megahertz and 120 megs of RAM. There's not much computing power behind that. So trying to write an app like Facebook to do all of that interactivity, you knew it was going to be slow. Same thing for iPhone 4. A little bit better. Well, now look at 2014. iPhone 6, 1.4 gigahertz dual core, gig of memory. In the 6S, there's a 1.8 dual core, 2 gigs of memory. It's now literally a computer in your pocket. So all those performance issues due to power that didn't have gone away. The browser engines have also caught up. Back in 2012 when he said that, Android was really bad about not being standards compliant. Every vendor got to do their own version of the browser engine. Under the covers, it was all technically Chromium, but with their enhancements. They've now since gone the other way and said, no more vendor-specific ones. Instead, it's all the standard Chromium stuff. So Android's gotten better. iOS has gotten faster with their web browser. So we can do all of that power that we've always been able to do. Now here's the crazy part for the next 2 slides. This is the setup you typically go through to get all this working. For Android, you can do it on all the platforms. You need the Java SDK, you need the Android SDK, you need Gradle to do the build it, you need Google Chrome for your debugging. If you don't have an Android device, you need the Android emulator. You also need the Intel Haxum device driver in order to get a fast emulator. Without it, the Google emulator literally takes a good 15, 20 minutes just to get started. You put the Intel driver on there, and it's 10 seconds, 30 seconds. The downside of having that driver, it doesn't play well with Hyper-V on Windows, which means you can't play with Docker at the same time. You also need a Google developer account in order to put your stuff in the App Store, or the Play Store actually for Google. iOS is just as crazy. Biggest difference, you can only do it on a Mac. This is an Apple requirement. You have to have Xcode. You need their command line tools. They have an iOS simulator, similar to the emulator for Android. Safari does all the debugging. You need an Apple developer account. And the Apple developer account's a little different than the Google one. Google's $25 lifetime. Apple is $99 a year. And if you stop paying for it, your app drops out of the Apple Store. So that's a lot of stuff to get configured for you. Making sure you get everything on the path correct so that everything works on the command line to build these things. Kind of a pain to set up. It's where Visual Studio Tools for Apache Cordova comes to the rescue for you. It installs all of those dependencies for us. Granted, you still need a Mac somewhere, and later you'll see how we get around having to actually have a Mac. It installs all the Android stuff, sets up all the path stuff. Everything you would expect Visual Studio to do for us traditionally is there. You do all your development entirely in Visual Studio. Don't have to drop to the command line, don't have to do other funky stuff to get it working. They've got a nice UI to add all of those device plugins. And without that, you normally have to drop to the command line and do a Cordova plugin add. So there's just a nice little UI. You can search for stuff. And then we get all of our standard Visual Studio stuff, templates, debuggers. I can launch the emulators. I can test stuff in the web browser. I can do deployments to devices, all without leaving Visual Studio. And all of this stuff is free in Visual Studio from the Community Edition up. So there's nothing hidden there. They have tons of documentation at taco.visualstudio.com. They have tutorials there. They have walkthroughs of how to get everything set up. All kinds of help stuff there, how to do remote builds for iOS, all kinds of stuff. Take a little look at how all of this works. So once you install, in 2017, the workload that you want is mobile JavaScript development. That will give you everything you need for Apache Cordova. And once you get that, when you go under new project, you'll see a few templates. So under TypeScript, you'll get a blank Apache Cordova. And then under JavaScript, you'll also get the blank Apache Cordova app. When you create either of these, it is just a shell. The thing Cordova is 100% missing is a UI framework. It's just middleware, so it's up to you to bring the UI framework. Which means you can use jQuery if you really wanted to. It'll probably be slow on an actual mobile device just because of the way it works. You can bring Ionic. You name a framework, you could bring it as long as it's web-based. You do not use Xamarin because Xamarin is all C# and transpiles from the C# down to a true native device. There is no web view for a Xamarin app. That's some totally different technologies. Once you create the app, you get this little project here. I already created it so you don't have to sit here and watch NPM actually do its install, all stuff behind the scenes. But there's not much here for it. You get a little www folder with all your files in it, and it's up to you to program stuff. It's like this example doesn't have a whole lot of anything in it UI-wise. So do the quick build here. You can see it does tons of stuff behind the scenes. I still have the detailed log showing. In a moment, it will launch a browser, and we can play around with this app a little bit. For all of this development, you'll probably do about 80 to 90% of all of your development work and testing will be done in the browser. And it's much faster here to actually get the browser launched, hook up a debugger. If I actually hooked up a device and tried to do the same thing, it's a good 3 to 5 minutes to do the compilation steps, deploy it over USB onto the device at a minimum. The last demo I'm going to show today actually does a device deploy, and I had to do it as a video demo when I ran it at home testing out. It was 14 minutes to get that deployment done. And between sending some stuff remote, deploying it, like imagine that every time you had to do that versus it took 30 seconds at most. Sure, and now I can actually play with the app. See, you guys got beautiful weather going here. Kind of afraid to look to see. And shockingly, we're only at 82 degrees, but it is also 7 a.m. in Phoenix, where I'm from. I guarantee it's going to be 105, 110 degrees today versus the 80 that. But you can see there's not a lot of flair to this UI. It looks pretty plain in here. I'm sure if I could get this thing to resize, which let's go look and see. Let's do an iPad Pro. So it just looks like I stretched out the screen. Like there's nothing fancy with this. The sizing's not the greatest. You know, trying to read this even on the screen right in front of me is a little rough. So it doesn't increase everything, doesn't do all the UI stuff. It's functional, but doesn't do the UI stuff for me. So we'll see a little later how we can change that around. But some of the stuff back in Visual Studio that we get here is for this simulator, I can change my devices so I can get all the different iOS devices, iPads, Pros, iPhone 4, 5, 6, 6 Plus. Hopefully at some point they'll add 7 in here. They're constantly updating this. I can also change my iOS version. All of these on the fly will change the UI. As you saw when I changed to iPad Pro, it had already updated the display before I even switched back to it. You'll notice there's no Android in here. In order to switch between iOS and Android, I have to stop the debugger and just change my, right up here at the top, instead of saying iOS, I can drop it down and do Android and do the same simulator. You just see what the Android view would actually look like. I can also see all of my geolocation here. So all the plugins that I've added for the native capabilities, I can then play with them in here. Down a little. So I can change longitude, latitude. I can zoom in the map. I can also change my location if I really wanted to, and it would automatically update everything in the browser. So great way to be able to do simulations and play around with stuff. So let's stop our debugger here. So in the Solution Explorer, one of the files they always give you is this config XML. So look at a little code here. So So behind the scenes, config XML has what all of our screenshots are, or what our mapping is for the App Store, our descriptions, what versions of the different platforms we want to use, plugins. Nobody really wants to edit an XML file, let's just be honest. If I actually double click on it instead of right clicking and say view code, ask me if I want to close it, then it gives me an actual UI to do configurations. What version of Cordova do I want to use? Do I want to use my globally installed one, or do I want to use the one that came with Visual Studio? Like I said, all my common stuff, display names that'll show up in the App Store. What are my descriptions? What's my unique package name for it? Here's all the device plugins. So I can go look through and go, hey, if I want to do notifications, just do add. It'll update my config file, add everything in that I need in order to start using that. I mentioned the Windows is still here for a platform, but it's Windows Store. So it's not Windows Phone like it used to be. So you can still do a Windows Store version of the app. You can set up all your Android stuff. You can set up all your iOS stuff. Much nicer than editing that XML file. It gives you all of that bits of functionality. If I go under options and look at the tools for Apache Cordova, if I config, one of the things it does for you by default is sets up, installs Java, installs Git for you, the Android SDK, sets up all your path variables. If for some reason you go, I want to update the Android SDK to something else, because I have custom config, you can easily override everything. You can set up your Android emulator to detect whether you have the Intel Haxum engine installed or not. If not, it'll fall back. It'll also give you some warnings. We'll talk a little bit later about iOS configurations. There's some stuff here to do some remote deploys. Then how to do all of your plugin simulations. I rarely go, except for the iOS configs, I don't really have to change anything in here. Out of the box, everything works beautifully for me. So I can immediately start doing actual development work versus those 2 slides of let's install all of these craziness. I don't have to worry about that. Questions on Cordova before I move on to the next section? So Cordova is actually an open source framework that Adobe owns ultimately. The tools for Apache Cordova that we're playing with is a tool set that's available in the community edition of Visual Studio. Yeah, and I don't believe there's any additional features when you go up in versions.
So did you say when you install the taco, does it include the SDKs that you would otherwise need?
Yep, include everything that's on. Go back a couple slides here. We're back, come on, there we go. All of this stuff. Mine is the very bottom one. It doesn't give you a free Google developer account. But you get everything else, the Java SDKs, the Android SDK, Gradle. Doesn't give you Google Chrome. You have to install that separately. Nothing makes you have to use Google Chrome. The power of Google Chrome is when I have an actual Android device, I can hook up the debugger that you normally get in Chrome to go straight to my device and do debugging on the device. So typically put that piece in there. Everything else is there for you, pre-configured. All the path variables are set up. All of the platforms are installed so that you don't have to go through that process.
Same thing for Apple, that gives you even the APA file? Or?
So Apple is a little different because it requires a Mac.
Okay. And
a little later I'll show you how you can actually use a Mac and still stay within Visual Studio and do all of your deployments to an iOS device. Unfortunately, Apple requires you to have a Mac. Some point, maybe we'll get some simulators and other stuff. I know on the Xamarin side, for Windows, they actually have an iOS simulator, a true simulator that you can launch. So I'm hoping eventually that makes it back into the Cordova tooling. It feels like if you've got the technology, it wouldn't be that hard to port it so that it works with the Cordova tooling as well as Xamarin. That's just a hope. I'm not an MVP or anything, so I don't have any inside knowledge. I'm just a hopeful user. Quote me all you want. Maybe if enough of us ask them, they'll go, oh.
Visual Studio 17, right?
It works in 2015 as well, but I'm on 2017.
I know when I downloaded 17, the out the box, if you wanted to start integrating moving forward. 15, I think I have to update it or something like that.
Yeah, there's some, I think it's, I can't remember, it's been a while since I've used 2015, but I think update 3, they fixed a lot of stuff with it. But I'm on 2017 just because it's the latest and greatest version that's actually production released. And it feels pretty stable so far. Yeah. So I've talked a bunch about Cordova tooling, or Cordova in general doesn't have a UI framework. You can pick anything that you want to pick. The one I've picked is Ionic. Ionic does tons of the work for me. So I feel like it really is that missing UI framework. I don't have to worry about writing the CSS so my device resizes itself properly or changes the format. I don't have to worry about my back button looks different on Android versus iOS. And we'll see that in the demo that on iOS it has an arrow and says back. On Android, it's just an arrow. Like, I don't have to worry about that with Ionic. I have to worry about my icons being different. They just look right for the platform without me coding any of it. I really like it's built on top of Angular because that's where I build my websites. So I didn't have to learn a new underlying framework for Ionic. I just had to learn their components, which really is how they've built it. It's a bunch of Angular components from the UI standpoint. So if you've used any Angular library, you already know how to use the components. So then it's just reading the documentation and go, how do I make this one look like I want it to look? And how do I implement this feature that's in the docs? So it's really quick to get up to speed with it. I love that they're performance obsessed. They were one of the first frameworks to get rid of the 300 millisecond delay that we have when we do web-based stuff like this. By default, up until recently, every device, when you click on the app, and then if it would wait to go, are you doing a long click so that I pop up that little right-click menu where you can do like copies and paste and stuff? Or are you actually clicking on it to go somewhere else, like a link to my next page in my app? 300 milliseconds doesn't sound like a long time, but it's just enough that you question, did it actually accept what I clicked on? And then you're like, let me try it a few more times. They got rid of that right off the bat. It's one of the first things that they did. So that it instantly went there because they're like, I'm in a mobile app. I know what I'm doing. I'm not right-clicking on my mobile app to copy stuff. They worried a bunch about transitions between pages. They wanted it to look like it belonged on the platform. Looking at the drop shadows, looking at the animations, what side of the screen did it come in from, and mirroring them to the point that the performance was exactly the same as a full native application. Because their goal is you don't have to know it's an Ionic app. For some of the more popular Ionic apps, like I love Sworkit, which is a fitness app. If I didn't tell you it was an Ionic app, you would never know. I've played with it where it shows a little nice screen at the beginning, a little wheel that I can pick. What kind of fitness do I want to do? You click on it. What, do you want to do intense? Do you want to do lightweight? How long do you want to go? It gives me a little preview video then for each of the exercises once I pick the type. Plays the video, it has a countdown in there, and not once have I seen the thing stutter. Like you would think, oh, it's web, it's probably going to be a little laggy. Not at all. And the only reason I even knew it was Ionic is it was in their showcase, else I would never know. And that was their goal with the performance. This one's huge for me, zero code redundancy. So many times when we talk about these frameworks that allow you to go to both devices, you have a UI for one, you have another UI project for the other, and then you share all the business logic. Well, that's a lot to still maintain. And I don't want to do my UI twice. Here I do my UI once, and I don't have to change anything. I don't have any platform-specific items that I need to do to make Android look like it should and iOS look like it should. They do all that for me. And I know you two in the front row mentioned you do a bunch of stuff with Ionic 1. Ionic 1 was like 90% there. You still had like icons they didn't do automatically for you. Ionic 2, they've done the icons for you. They're more closer to like 98, 99% platform continuity. And so they've really worked on trying to finish up those last few things. And icons don't seem like a huge thing, But if a user's looking for a specific icon, like the phone looks different between iOS and Android, it's just enough of a difference that you may go, is this going to do what I want it to do? It's like, let's just give them the right one. Let's not make them think about it. And so now they do that for you. They give you tons of components out of the box, all the standard stuff that we'd expect. We get tabs, side menus. We get cards. Facebook's kind of made popular. We have a little header, you have some content, and then you have some buttons at the bottom. Normally that's where we see like the sharing buttons when we look on some of those sites. We get headers and footers on pages, all the standard forms and all the form fields. You get buttons, and they have tons of buttons. You can do a normal size button, full screen button, a bar of buttons where they take however many buttons you tell it and make them all evenly spaced across the screen and divide it up. New different colors, like buttons galore. You get pop-ups, spinners, modals. The slide box is kind of cool. It's what you see a lot of times when you open an app for the first time and it gives you a screen of tutorial. You swipe, gives you the next tutorial screen. You keep going, or you can skip the tutorial. They give you that one. All kinds of gestures, keyboards, customizations, all out of the box and for free. They also have Ionic Native. It's their interface into all those Cordova plugins. And it wraps all the plugins. One of the huge things that they did with the Ionic Native release is gives you a common interface for all of the plugins. That was one thing they didn't have before. Every plugin had its own interface that you do. You had to read the docs, figure out, how do I use this one? Now they're all standardized across the board. And they all return promises and observables. They do all that wrapping for you so that you don't have to worry about it. So they're super easy to use and implement now. I saw the Ionic Native recently, was looking at it, went, oh, this is way easier than what they previously had. Because they've always had the wrapper, but it didn't have the standard interface. In Ionic 1, it took a bit to figure out every one of the plugins. Ionic 2, it just naturally feels like it fits in. So we saw this runtime earlier for Apache Cordova. For Ionic, on top of the web view, we put Angular, and on top of that, we put Ionic. So it just keeps building on the same platform that we've already looked at earlier. App creation has two ways to do it. In Visual Studio, you need the NPM Task Runner extension so that you can run all the NPM scripts before it does the Visual Studio build. Then you want, in Visual Studio Marketplace, you want the Ionic 2 templates. And I say templates with a caveat right now. I've noticed they're a little bit behind. So Ionic is still in the point they haven't done an Ionic 2 production release. They're at a release candidate stage, but the Ionic 2 templates are slightly behind. Their last update was in March. So I know they've had almost every month Ionic's doing a release, and so they're slightly outdated right now, which is where the second way to actually do the app, and we'll actually look at this in a bit, is you still need the NPM Task Runner, but then you use the Ionic command line, generate your project so you get all the latest and greatest. And in Visual Studio, you go under File, New, and at the very bottom option says Project from Code. You pick that, and then you navigate to wherever you just created your Ionic project on the command line, and that'll import into Visual Studio, and it's still fully compatible with the command line. You just now can use everything in Visual Studio. Much nicer way to keep up to date. And then you add the before build runner for the Ionic build in that Task Runner Explorer. We'll take a look at this in a moment. There's lots of tooling that Ionic also gives you, some for free and some paid. So first one that's free is icon and splash screen sizing. Doesn't sound like a huge deal until you realize there's 46 different icons and splash screen sizes and configurations if you go for every possible Android and iOS device. So imagine having to resize your icon and splash screen that many times and to go to update that config XML to put in what the size is, get the names all right for each of those. That's a lot of work. The splash screen sizing, you give it the max size icon and max size splash screen centered, send it up to their server, about 30 seconds later, they've resized to all 46, and they brought it back down to your machine and updated the config XML file with all of those for free. Can't beat that deal. Ionic View is an app that you install on your device, and for each of your Ionic projects, you can upload it to their servers. It gives you a 6-digit code. You put that into Ionic View, it will download that and run it on your device in a little sandbox so that you can do testing. You can give it out to other users. So I could upload one of my apps, give you that 6-digit code, and then you could do all the testing and see, does it look right? Am I finding bugs in it? And you don't have to go through the whole beta process for either the App Store or the Play Store. Like I know specifically for the Apple Store, you have a limited number of beta users that you can actually set up per year. It's like 100 beta users. So if you get a lot of apps, you don't want to exceed that. Ionic View doesn't go through that. And you still get to sandbox everything, do all your testing. Great way to send stuff to clients to go, hey, is this looking like what you want it to look like? And you can actually be able to have it on the device. And that's totally free for that whole feature. Creator is a paid product. It is their drag and drop kind of editor. All web-based. You can go and create prototypes in there. If you pay for one of their upper packages, it'll actually create full starter kits for you. So just like all the templates we get in Visual Studio, you can go through there, design your whole app, design all the navigation between pages, and then it gives you a specific URL, and you say Ionic Start, give it that URL, and it will pull it down as an Ionic project for you. So great little tool, just paid. I think their lowest price starts at $14 a month and goes up to somewhere in the neighborhood of $50. Marketplace is a really neat thing in that it's really for us as developers. They do all the hosting for us, and we get to upload templates, themes, components, either give them away for free if we want, or we can sell them, and they give us 100% of the proceeds for selling, and they do all the hosting for free. And good majority of the stuff that's up there, especially for like templates and components, has the 6-digit Ionic View. So you can see, what am I actually going to get for this $5, $10, $20? Most of them are $30 or less. If they're for paid, probably at least 60, 70% are totally free. And they give you all the codes, you can play around with it. The last piece is the Ionic platform. All the services in the platform have a free tier that's pretty decent. Like push notifications, you get something like 100,000 push notifications a month, 100 Ionic builds. So they have a in the cloud build, continuous integration kind of a deal for you. They've got authentication, a couple other services in there that you get a decent amount for a small app, or it's a minimum amount of money on a sliding scale depending on how much you need. You need 1 million push notifications a month. You just slide the scale up and see what it's going to actually cost you. You're not required to use any of the Ionic platform at all. Their goal is that you'll like the stuff that they have to offer. It'll provide enough benefit to you that you'll want to pay for it ultimately. That's ultimately how they're going to survive as a company, because the framework itself always going to be free. It's fully open source, but they got to make money somehow, and the platform's kind of the goal. Just looking at it, yeah, if you've got a even semi-popular app, yeah, you're going to want to pay for some of those features. To try to implement push notifications, you'd have to go to Android and do it all on Android. You have to go to iOS, do it on iOS, go to both app stores, set up all the stuff so it'll go through. They do all that work for you. So you just send it to them, and they send it all out where it needs to be. Stuff like that's well worth the time. 5 minutes versus 2, 3, 4 hours. Definitely worth the time. So now some demo stuff. Let's launch this one up. So we're going to take a look at the same weather app that we had before, but we're going to look at it with the Ionic framework built in. So the first thing it does, because we've set up the Task Runner Explorer, so we told it for this Ionic build, I can click on bindings here. Before the build, go ahead and run the npm start command ionic:build, and that takes care of all of our compilations for TypeScript back to JavaScript, SCSS, SAS stuff back to regular CSS, does all the Webpack bundling for us, moves all the files where it needs to be so you can actually play with it, and then it hits the Visual Studio build and goes through what Visual Studio needs in order to launch the debugger and start up their web browser simulator. And it's a little slower on my machine. I have 8 gigs of memory, and I've got 3 versions of Visual Studio running right now. But if I went down to 1, you'd definitely see this speed up a little bit. But even now, it's what, a minute or less. Listen, I'll be able to actually play with it, set deep breakpoints in Visual Studio. And there we go. So you can see right off the bat, it just looks a little bit nicer. We've got the blue buttons versus everything being gray. We've got a little tab in here to say, give me my current forecast. Let's zoom this in a little. Or let's go look and see what's it going to be in 3-hour increments for the next 12 hours. Because I'm looking at iOS, and automatically puts this little right arrow here to tell me, hey, if I click on this, I'm going to get a little bit more details. We can see our back button has the arrow, the back in it. So let's stop this and look at Android here real quick. And you'll see a little bit of difference. Wait for it to switch over all the targets here. So there's several targets in here. I can either do device, I can do the emulators, which I don't have installed right now, or I can simulate several different devices, Nexus, Galaxies, and we'll just pick one, why not? Maybe. So it is working on swapping them over. Here we go. Back to do the same build in a moment. The one thing that definitely drives me nuts is it doesn't pop up the Task Runner Explorer when it starts building. It just pops up this output window. And unless you catch way down at the bottom here that it's running something in the Task Runner, you're like, is this thing hung? Is it going to do anything? And it's like, yes. It's just in the middle of running this. So I can definitely tell the machine's being used a little at 31 seconds. If I'm not recording, if I'm not having multiple versions of Visual Studio open on this little underpowered laptop, it's like 10 seconds instead of the 30 plus. While we're waiting for this, any questions?
What are the size of the outputs of the deliverables? Because that was the one thing that I heard some people say is that the actual the APK and the IPA are much larger. What are the actual size of the APK?
That's a great question. I do not know off the top of my head. Okay. I do know one thing that a lot of times will increase it, at least for Android. A lot of people still include crosswalk, which was the way to use the standard browser engine. So it would bundle basically Chromium into your app bundle. So you took about a 40 to 60 meg hit for that. But the upside is you got standardized performance across every Android device. It's not as big of a deal since 4.4 came out, because that's the point that they went and said everything's going to be the standard Chromium. Before that, it was just the Wild West of what standards got supported. So they're on 6 or 7 for the Android stuff now. 7. Okay.
That's an 8, right?
Okay. If I had an Android device, I would know that, but I'm an iOS guy.
For the apps that I'm building, my APK, I've got used a lot of the Apache Cordova plugins, and it's 30 megs for the APK, and the IPA is, I think it was 81 megs. Not huge.
So we can already see a few differences in our Android version. Button looks slightly different. The tabs, instead of being full colored blue, I just get the highlight in a little line underneath to say which one I'm on. you'll notice there's no arrow now. A standard Android thing is there's no arrow to tell you there's something to click on there. It automatically removed that. There's no code on my side that said remove that or not. Same thing for the back button. So you see it's just an arrow. It also puts our title on the left side. iOS puts it in the middle. So all that stuff Ionic takes care of for you. Which in turn,
Customize it if you want to.
or you can totally customize, especially with 2. So 2 actually has a huge list of things you can configure. You can change how do I want the back button to actually look. You could make them the same across everything. You could make them different per platform like they currently are. Or you can put stuff in there for that. You can do titles. You can do alignments. There's a huge list of configurations now without actually even touching code. You literally go into the Ionic config file and just go, I want this one, and off and running. And so that's much nicer than 1. And with Ionic 1, you had to actually go through and update the JavaScript stuff yourself and override stuff in your JavaScript. Now it's configurations, which is pretty darn awesome. Let's look at one more app. So that was the difference between the weather app. We could see a bunch of differences there. So next app is a free one that the Ionic team gives away as a demo app. It's a conference style app, so everything you would expect a conference to have. List of sessions, list of speakers, a location map. And we'll get to see a whole slew of controls that it has. I'm going to say watching builds run is like watching paint dry.
So when you're doing your debugging, are you setting, like say you set a breakpoint, do you do that in Visual Studio or do you do that in the browser?
Visual Studio. So one of the, I'm going to call it a feature of Chrome is the minute you launch, when you hook a debugger up to Chrome from another app, like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, and then you open up the Chrome DevTools, it immediately kills the other app that was doing the debugging. And so it's just kind of annoying because you're used to right-clicking on it as a web developer and go inspect to actually look at it. You do that, it immediately will stop the Visual Studio debugging. It's just a feature of Chrome, unfortunately. See if I can get this thing to allow me to play with it. So let's look at, instead of breakpoint just because you asked. I would expect, see if I can actually get it to hit in the middle here. Yeah. So now I can play around with the speaker list. I can do all this normal debugging I want, inspect it, update it. So you can set them as many as you want, and it will hit them. So this view that I have right here is what they call the card. So little header here with the speaker's name, all the details in the middle, and a whole bunch of sharing buttons. Sometimes they're top to bottom, sometimes they're left to right. It just depends on how you've actually set up your code. We saw geolocation a little earlier. This one has maps built into it. So same geolocation tag, but now it's actually pinning on a map in the UI for you, as well as setting up some other pinned items. That's awesome of Visual Studio. Then kind of a standard about page, we see little drop downs. For Android, it pops these up. If I was on iOS, you'd get a pop-up down at the bottom for it. So they take care of those pieces for us. You can also have different stuff in the, like the upper right, you'll notice change the 3 drop downs. So it's a little popover where that's included. So let's look at code here. 'Cause I've talked a little bit about how easy it is to do this stuff. me pull up the speaker list code. There we go. So this Ionic card is a built-in component, and that's what starts that look. I can say, hey, here's my header, put my buttons, whatever else I want in here, and then here's my content. In this case, that content's actually a grid. That's what the Ion list is the grid. I can put all my buttons, everything in here. I only have one item in my list. And then it does all the formatting for me. And you can see that separating them out, I don't want any padding or anything else. So I didn't have to worry about resizing, having it look correct. Let me look at the header here and get the, so that little, so we look back here, we can see, or maybe not. All right, unzoom, there we go. Let's look back at the speaker page here real quick. So for this little avatar, this little circle thing, for the picture, that is nothing more than Ion avatar and giving it an image. It'll automatically resize it and make it look circular. That's some of the power in there. To actually write that CSS to get it to work across all the devices, that's a decent amount of troubleshooting and coding just to get it working. They've got all those standard things built in, so you focus really on your business logic. So look at one more demo. And we'll hear it, and then we'll head back to some slides. So I mentioned earlier that you can import files or import projects. So when you do the file new, you get this project from existing code. So I had already generated my Ionic project earlier using the command line. So we'll navigate to that project. Give it a name. And it's going to go off and create my solution file. It's going to create my Visual Studio project file. And I'll be all set up to now start using Visual Studio instead of only having the command line available to me. So it takes a few minutes to set that up, and then everything we've looked at up to this point will work for us. The one caveat for this is I've noticed typically I have to go and delete the platforms folder out of the project that got generated. It's one of those folders that you don't check into version control. And it's where they put all the stuff you need to build Android and all the stuff you need to build iOS. And every time you download your project, it restores those as one of its dependencies anyway. That's the only thing I've had issues with where I have to go delete that. So we'll let that thing run for a bit. Good. We'll head back to some slides. So next demo is all about deploying to a locally connected iOS device. So I said earlier you have to have a Mac, which is still true. But what you can do is you can rent a Mac. So I rent a Mac at Mac and Cloud. It's $20 a month for 3 hours a day of usage. And it'll work as a remote build agent. So the process essentially is I rent that, I start up a program called Remote Build that's already installed for me on their Mac and Cloud. And then from iOS, I go into that configuration. If I want to have to head back to iOS here, or to Visual Studio here. If I go back under the tools for Visual Studio Cordova, we have this iOS configuration here. So I tell it, here's where my device support folders are. You can get that off the Mac. I give it a host name, give it a port that my remote build's running on, and then it'll create security certificates automatically for you and give you a PIN number that you stick in. Once I have that, I go into the drop-down for iOS, and I'll pick local device is from it. Once I do that, when I do the build steps I've been doing all day, instead of launching the browser, the next step is it goes and contacts that remote machine, sends all of my output from my Visual Studio build to the Mac, does all of my building for me, and sends it back. So if we look at the next slide here, we are going to watch a video of this. So it's the same build that we've already seen. It does all the all the Ionic builds here. And we'll see in a moment when it pops over to the output screen. So now we're at the point of doing our normal builds. We'll see in a sec, it pops up this little funky thing that says remote build, and it's going and contacting the Mac, which is what I have on the right side of the screen here. And it's sending all of my output up to there so it can compile it through Xcode ultimately. So you still have to set your provisioning profiles, all the stuff you would normally do for the Mac. But Mac and Cloud gives me everything that I need. For the couple folks in the room that have Macs, if other people on your same network or even remotely don't have a Mac and you want to allow them to do remote build, you can run the same remote build on your Mac and let other people do the builds. You just have to have a Mac somewhere. So at $20 a month for 3 hours of usage, which is a day, I don't do that much iOS development that I exceed that. And at $20 a month, it's like 3 years of usage before you get a decent performing Mac Mini out of it. And after 3 years, you're kind of at that point of maybe I should actually start replacing the hardware. So I don't mind paying $20. If you need more time, they have a plan for $50 a month that you get unlimited time. So if you're full iOS or full mobile dev shop, that might be a better plan. So we can already see here in the video, it finished all of the build on the Mac. It sent it all back down, or actually it's downloading it right now, back onto my Windows machine, which was this device. Once it gets it through iTunes, it's going to deploy everything to the device, is here, and then I can play with it just like I normally would. So this is what the conference app that we looked at earlier. You're all doing debugging on my device, all the breakpoints that I set earlier, I could set those, I could hit all of those. So pretty cool that I don't actually have to have a physical Mac to do it, or I don't have to buy a second machine. I can rent a machine, I can still stay in Visual Studio where I do most of my work. And that feature all comes for free. You just have to have a Mac somewhere. So some Ionic resources, because there's a lot out there. Their website has tons of stuff, including their docs. They've got some of the best docs I've ever seen for a framework. I've created whole apps just copying and pasting out of their docs and updating it to bind my data to the UI. I suggest you run their docs full screened. And when you get to the bigger resolutions, on the right side of the screen, they have looks like an iPhone emulator or Android emulator, and it shows you an example of the code that's on the dock right now. And as you scroll down, it keeps updating that code, and they all link over to a plunker. So right away, you can just copy paste out. You can play around with it, change stuff around, and some amazing docs. They have a wildly busy Slack channel. It's one of the few Slack channels that I actually 100% turn off notifications and 100% tell it, but I don't want to know when there's new stuff. Because there's thousands of messages a day that go through the Slack channel. But if you need instant help, there's typically people in there at least 8 to 5, like Wisconsin time, from the Ionic team answering questions. There's other community members that are sitting there that'll help out. I've seen several of them download people's code off GitHub, help them out, fixing issues. Great place to get instant help. There's several blogs. I love Andrew McGivery's blog. It says 15 Ionic resources. When I looked at it last month, he's at 60 plus. So he's kind of just grouping everything that he finds together, so there's just one spot to go look for tons of stuff. Josh Maroney puts out an insane amount of material. His goal, at one point he was blogging 5 days a week about full Ionic tutorials, and now I think he's down to 3 days a week and a bunch of videos. We've got so much material there. It's all free. DevDatic has a ton of tutorials as well. He's recently also has a premium content area. There's a few books. So Josh Maroney actually had the first Ionic 2 book that came out way back in early beta days. And he's kept it up. Every single release that's come out, I've gotten a notice from him saying, hey, I updated any chapters that were needed. So unlike most books, even the ebook versions, where it's like, oh, I put it out at this point in time and that's it. Now he's keeping that, he's updated, and he's got a tiered model for it. For the lowest tier, you get the book and like one sample app. As you go up to the upper tiers, you get the book, 2 or 3 sample apps, some templates for actually doing all of your App Store configurations, a bunch of Photoshop stuff, and lots of great stuff. And I think even the top tier is only like 120 bucks. It's a great way to learn. Devdatic also put out a book called Zero to App. Yep, fantastic info, and he's keeping that one up to date as well. And recently, O'Reilly actually released a book by Chris Griffith for doing Ionic mobile development. So in closing, say if you can make a great web page, you can make a great mobile app. Now that's the key. You've got to make the web page look great to make a mobile app look great. Say, time to go create your mobile app. Make sure to fill out evaluations for the sessions. I know they use those for raffles at the end, and they have some cool stuff in their raffles normally. You can get all the slides at slideshare.net/digitaldrummerj. You can also follow me on Twitter at digitaldrummerj, and my blog's at digitaldrummerj.me. Thank you.